Well, yeah, like you said, my name is Gavin Miles. I'm a first year IH student. And as you can tell, I'm going to be talking about the incidence of injuries for professional soccer players in MLS. So before I jump into my actual people I want to present on, I want to give you kind of a why I picked soccer of all the sports. I love sports. If you can't tell, I'm an athlete, right? I got the build for it. Totally kidding. But I love sports. I grew up playing sports ever since I was a little kid. I've played various sports, multiple sports, soccer, basketball, football, you name it. But soccer has a special place in my heart because that's the one that I've played the most. I started when I was probably 3.5 years old, 4 years old in a rec league, moved up to competition, and then played in high school. Here I am on the side right here. That's me. And then I eventually transitioned into being a coach for the same high school that I played for, which was actually a pretty cool kind of full circle moment for me. And I've done coaching, personal training, all of the things in between. So that's kind of why I picked this article and to give you guys some background. So jumping into it, it's kind of a macro scale purpose of this study, and it was to describe the epidemiology of injury throughout a span of 6 years in MLS. MLS is Major League Soccer. It's the major league here in the United States. There's like 28, 29 teams in it. And that's kind of the overarching purpose. And these are maybe some subset purposes. They achieve that purpose of describing epidemiology of injury in the league by quantifying injury incidents in MLS. Number two, by describing injury patterns and their severity. We'll get into some of that a little bit later on in the presentation. And then by comparing match versus training injuries. So this was a big part of their study. They wanted to see what settings created the biggest hazard and in what setting players were getting injured. So type of study, the article refers to it as a descriptive epidemiology study. I put it as a prospective cohort study because of these couple bullet points, right? It follows the league, the same players, contracted players for the span of 6 years, 6 seasons, and it looks at the injuries recorded as they occurred, but it's all observational, right? There's no intervention and there's no causal inference either. So kind of getting into the study population here, their methods section, these are kind of four of their main parameters that they looked into. So male professional MLS players, right? It's a men's league. And there's about 1,400 athletes throughout the span of this study, throughout the 6 different seasons. And I would add to these 1,400 athletes, they have to be signed, contracted to a given team throughout those seasons, right? So if they weren't sanctioned by the team, they didn't count as part of the study. And it's over those 6 seasons, like I mentioned, and it's league-wide. The authors of this study prided themselves in that because it's the first study done in the United States where it's a cohort study over multiple seasons with the whole league in as a scope, right? So with their data collection, it kind of meshes with their study population. They found their study population through what's called the Healthy Athlete database. And it's just this big database, online database that has each player's injury records, injury management records, their personal health records, and it's throughout the preseason, the postseason, and the regular season, of course. So this database is created by team medical staff reporting. So each team has their own assigned hired medical staff. And as injuries occur, one of their main jobs, one of their main responsibilities is to upload their injury report to this Healthy Athlete database, right? So that's kind of their centralized EMR system. It's been utilized in MLS for 4 years now. And they defined kind of their their exposure or their injury as any condition requiring medical attention. Okay. So I had kind of a qualm with this. I didn't love that definition because it's so broad. Any injury, that could mean like a stubbed toe, that could mean a concussion, different severities, broken legs, right? So I wish the injury definition was a little bit more focused or specific than it is, but that's what they gave us and that's what they went with. So mentioning some of the injuries or the data collected, they looked at position. So there's four main positions in soccer for those of you who may know or may not know, to provide some context. Starting from the goal forward, you have the goalie, goalkeeper, you have the defense, midfield, and the forwards. So they looked at different positions, the injury incidence or incidence rate in the different positions. They also looked at the year that a given player was injured. They also talked about settings, so different game settings, meaning the actual match itself, looking at training sessions, looking at conditioning, and they also looked at sanctioned team activities. For example, going on a hike with the team, what have you, would be qualified as a sanctioned team activity. And that's all logged in to this EMR, right, into the Healthy Athlete database. So getting into kind of the statistical analysis, talking about inclusion and exclusion criteria with the data. The exclusion criteria, they didn't want to include anybody less than 17 years of age or younger. They also didn't want to include, for their reasons referenced as excluding outliers and anomalies, for those injuries that were 1 year or longer of missed time, right? So they give an example of somebody who broke their leg and that injury accrued more than 1 year of recovery time to get back into playing. So they excluded 1 year time loss due to injury. They excluded incomplete medical records or injury reports, and they excluded unsanctioned team activities, right? So if I were a professional soccer player and I was playing with my buddies on the weekend and I got injured, that was excluded from the study, okay? So the statistical, what they've done here to analyze their data, they looked at two different rates, incidence rate and exposure rate. As you can tell here, the exposure rate was calculated by total minutes of match time added to the total minutes of training time divided by 60 minutes in an hour, right? Then their second analysis was to figure out the incidence rate per 1,000 hours. And as you can tell, the numerator is the number of injuries in that phase divided by the total exposure hours for all of the participating contracted or signed athletes, okay? Then you multiply that by 10,000. So these are kind of their main takeaways. What they're looking to get out of these statistical analyses is injuries per 1,000 hours of exposure, their match versus training exposures. They're looking to get descriptive statistics out of these formulas. And maybe another little hiccup that I noticed that I thought would be interesting or add another layer of complexity to this study is if they accounted for confounders, right? They just are looking at injuries. They're not looking at the age of the athlete necessarily. They're not looking at the field surface, previous injury, strength of athlete, the flexibility. So I think if they accounted for confounders, we would see some different results of what they reported. But getting into their results, they kind of divided it into incidents, injury patterns, and injury severity or time lost due to injury. So total injury incidents or total amount of injuries was 9,713. Remember, there was about 1,400 athletes over these 6 years, and it averaged to be about 1.1 injury per year per player. So that's kind of daunting if you're playing in MLS, right? Because you're bound to get hurt at some time, according to this study. So They looked at they then looked at how many injuries were in each of the 1,000 hours, and it came out to be 8.7 for 1,000 hours of playing time of exposure, right? They also looked at the comparison between match injuries versus training injuries, and they reported it to be 4 times more likely or 4 times greater to be injured in a match setting in a game than at practice. Then they also mentioned, they said it was appreciated that rates declined over time, right? So as these seasons continued, athletes were getting injured less, which is good news for the league. And then looking at injury patterns, they kind of divided the human body into different regions for their reporting. And they noticed that hamstring injuries of all the injuries were the most common. Okay. Then followed by ankle sprains and adductor strains. So a lot of lower extremity injuries were reported, and with the thigh being the most affected body region. Okay. Looking at injury severity, about 45% of the injuries did not result in any time lost, okay? Which is good for the league and good for the players because they can return to play quickly. But the average injury that was reported came back at 2 weeks missed, right? It was 14.8 days according to the article, which is unfortunate. Okay, that resulted in about 1.5 games being missed. It resulted in missing 4 to 5 practice sessions. And the severe injuries were less frequent, but they had a higher burden, right? Like I was saying, leg fractures were less frequent than hamstring strain, but they had a higher burden on the player, meaning it took them longer to recover and return to the sport. So these are kind of the result tables. They're also listed in the article itself. There's one super long table that I couldn't fit in the presentation, so you'll have to look at the article there. I apologize for that. But this first table, as you can see, is injury setting. So you have the conditioning, then your match, then your training sessions, and then sanction trainings, right? Sanction trainings being with the team. Then it breaks it down by the different season, and you can see the similarities, the differences in that table, followed by their second table, which is injury by body region. So you can notice here, big long list of different areas or regions of the body that they refer to. The highest 3, the top 3 that they noticed were the thigh being the highest, followed by the knee and the ankle. So getting into some strengths and limitations, right? I thought it was neat that they did a whole, they looked at the league as a whole, right? They included each of the different teams. It was a prospective design, so they're following these same players throughout the 6 seasons. And I liked that. I qualified it as a strength, that it was a standardized exposure metric, right? That it was, everybody was kind of in that same pool. And that it was a long follow-up, right? 6 years is a good study length for these athletes. Some of the limitations, and if you've read the article or look at the article, you'll notice they have a section of limitations, right? And these are some of the limitations that they mention in their article, being there isn't a risk factor analysis, right? They're not looking at intrinsic characteristics behind these injuries. And I wish they would, because I think that would intrigue the reader even more. But maybe that's a space for future research. Another limitation is that injury definition, right? There's not many specifics behind it. It's just any medical condition requiring medical attention, right? So then another limitation that was noted is the reporting variability. Remember, each of these teams have a medical staff that's in charge of reporting each of these injuries, right? There's a lot of variability in that, and a lot of leeway in time and how detailed they are in their report. So that could be a limitation there. Another limitation is the limited contextual data. There's nothing about how the injury occurred, when it occurred, what the player was doing or participating in when they were injured, right? It just reports the injury. So skipping ahead into some of these practical implementations of how this research could be used is focusing on match day prevention, right? Looking at how you can train your athletes, train these players to be more match day ready. Maybe that might be fast-paced exercise or fast-paced participation in training. So when they're turning it up a notch, for lack of better words, in the game, their body has already adapted to that change, right? Looking at thigh region load management and maybe creating a baseline surveillance for these players to undergo. And then previously mentioned a little bit about future research directions. I like these. I think there's space to expound upon this study and look at more of the specifics, right? Look at more of those confounders that may lead into these injuries. Meaning, how does travel time or travel distance play into injuries in these players, right? The sedentary nature of traveling to their match location. Looking at the surface impacts, I've played on both grass and turf, and they're very different surfaces, right? Maybe looking at climate impacts, rain, snow, shine, how that plays into these players' fatigue, eventually leading to their injury. And ultimately looking into into an intervention effectiveness program, maybe looking at how these players are treated when they are injured and seeing how fast or how quickly they recover and are back into play. So I have some discussion questions for you guys. I'm interested to hear your thoughts and your questions, but my question for you guys to kind of kick into the discussion question is, how else do you think they could use this research, just looking at the broad definition of injury, into future intervention, right? Because there's no intervention in this study. How could they take this and implement that to a prevention strategy?
Well, I think the first thing is that this, you know, as good or bad as this data is, because this is their data, this is the, Major League Soccer's database, right?
Yeah, correct.
So for better or worse, I'm sure there are plenty of issues with their data collection.
I agree.
I'm not hurt. I'm not really. I'm not right. I mean, and that happens in every profession, not just a sport. That being said, this gives them some trends, right? They can say, okay, most of our injuries or a lot of our injuries are this, a lot of injuries are that, and then they could actually do select interventions targeting those types of injuries, those types of issues that are presenting as a result of play or non-play related activities, right? So I think that's pretty handy for them to have this report and this data. I imagine they're probably doing some of this already. I mean, you would think that if they're collecting this information and they know that one of their biggest problems is that, whatever,
Agreed.
they're training them out of that injury, hopefully, right?
Yeah.
But there's probably still things that they identified that they hadn't really thought about or whatever.
Yeah, for sure.
That's one thought.
Yeah, I like that. And I agree with your point of players getting injured and not reporting it to the medical staff so they can continue to play, right? I mean, like you mentioned, we see this in all different occupations.
Yeah.
So, yeah, what else?
So I was just wondering, did they ever compare this to the Euro League?
Yeah, they did actually. And I'm glad you brought that up. So they looked at different incidents or injury incidents in the Barclays Premier League, the BPL. And it was very similar. So their incidence rate here in MLS was 8.7. In the BPL in Europe was 7.6, down to 6.2 over a similar year span. So it's a little bit lower than it is here in the US, but similar nonetheless. They also looked at training injuries. And here it was the 4.1 times more likely to be injured in a match. And in Europe, it was 7 times more likely to be injured in a match, all the way up to 20x, right? So it's a big gap, a big difference. And there might be some underlying factors to that, maybe intensity of play in a match, maybe training plays into that as well. But yeah, they did draw some comparisons.
Your questions, Cal.
The slideshow just disappeared, but.
You can keep going. I'll try and pop them back up.
Okay. No, I was gonna say, how do you guys think the surface would change? Because I know briefly, maybe a couple of weeks ago, we talked about that in football, how there's a difference between turf and grass and how some athletes will like refuse to play on different surfaces. Do you guys, what are your thoughts on that? What are your insights on surfaces?
Are most soccer fields turf nowadays?
It's a big mix, yeah. I know a lot of high schools is turf. I know, but for MLS, I think they're trying to transition into soccer or soccer pitches being grass now, especially with the introduction of famous athletes like Lionel Messi. Yeah.
I'm just curious what your thought is on the question regarding the non-time loss injuries. What do you think are the pros and cons of including those?
Yeah, I go back and forth because with their definition, they're looking at all injuries. So I think for the purposes of their study, it should be included. I think we would see maybe some more specifics if they took them out as far as injury severity, right? Looking at more of the fractures, the muscle tears, the pulls, and it would change the data in a way that would be maybe more instructive to prevention, if that makes sense. Being able to say, hey, well, we're looking at what actually led to time loss, and we can address that now rather than having a larger pool of statistics or injuries that don't affect players as much. That's kind of my take on it. What's your thought, Bo?
That was my thought, because injuries where a player is not losing time for the purposes of the soccer player's occupation are not nearly as relevant as injuries that actually cause a player to miss time. So if you're trying to sort of narrow in on something that can improve time loss, it seems like that would be more relevant.
Back to the turf. So you were saying that they're switching back over to grass.
They're trying to, yeah.
Yay for grass.
How many of them are playing on turf right now?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know off the top of my head as far as how many teams exactly.
Yeah, we had that journal club a few weeks ago about NFL turf versus, big stuff. And similar types of things were coming out. I know that who was it? Was saying that their I don't know if it's the European teams or the South American teams just would refuse to won't play in the US if they have to play on grass.
Yeah.
Things for various reasons. If nothing else, the injuries, but also the ball it behaves differently on these different surfaces.
Yeah, like you're saying, the speed of play is drastically different. The ball control is very independent, playing on artificial grass versus natural grass.
I wonder why the US teams always struggle against European teams or any teams anywhere else. And if they're playing on different surfaces, it's really hard. I mean, that makes a big difference.
Yeah.
The grass moves differently than, plastic.
But Drake, I think it's a pretty close split. But I know they are transitioning to natural grass.
Makes sense.
I know we mentioned it briefly or talked about different occupations. How can you guys think of ways to generalize this to other occupations? Is that even possible?
Yeah, I would think from a layman's perspective, maybe not generalizable, because the training and the day-to-day life of an elite level athlete.
Yeah.
Visibly, I mean, even soccer is different than basketball, is different than baseball, than I mean, it's so specific to soccer training that for me it'd be hard to generalize to, especially non-athletic occupations, but even within other sports.
Yeah. My thought was similar to that as well. I thought it was maybe closely generalizable to other sports, right? Just as far as a training perspective to how that translates to game day. But I agree with you. I don't know that it's very generalizable to other occupations. Other thoughts to that?
I mean, one maybe is the military. They do training, but I don't think it's the exact same.
Yeah,
It's a lot of physical activity and it's strenuous.
that's true.
So, but I don't know the incidents. Maybe they don't get many injuries in boot camp, so
Yeah.
maybe it's not an issue.
I wouldn't be able to tell you because I haven't been to boot camp myself, but yeah, that would be an interesting comparison to draw if there's a relationship. Yeah.
We got a comment from someone online. Jordan, you raise your hand. Try unmuting and let it rip.
Yeah, so I just had a question. I know that the World Cup is coming to like North America and specifically the United States. I was wondering if they have had conversations with like venues in the US of making it mandatory for grass fields or if they're planning on um playing on turf. This isn't really anything to do with the research, but I was just wondering if if there's conversations about that and if there's any worries with that.
Yeah, that's a good question. You'll have to fact check me on that, but I believe they're all going to be grass fields for the World Cup. Because I think conversations have been had with FIFA, which is like the International Football Association. And I think they came to the conclusion of playing on grass fields for different reasons, right? The nature of the game has changed for player safety. So yeah, but double check me on that. Thanks, Jordan.
Yeah, thanks.
Anything else?
Going one. Oh, yeah. Go.
Yeah.
It seems like the defense position is having a higher injury incidence.
Mhm.
Why is that?
Yeah, so in the article, they report the midfielders to have the highest incidence rate, followed by defenders.
Okay.
And it was actually interesting to see the injury regions be different because they're different regions. So defenders reported to have higher upper body extremity injuries, and midfielders had lower extremity body injuries. So they, in their discussion, tried to tie that back to the demands on the body of a midfielder being both in the defense and the offense of the team. And that's a lot of load on your lower extremity, right? A lot of change of direction, a lot of change of speed, acceleration, deceleration. And they attributed the defense to upper body extremities because of defending the ball in the air, their slide tackles, right? The jumble of bodies when they're going down. And so, yeah, it was interesting to see the different injury types between the different players. And I played defense myself, and I rarely ever had lower body extremities. It was always head injuries, concussions, what have you. And so I would concur with their conclusion. Thanks.
Anything else for Gavin on this one? Going once, going twice, gone.
Thank you.
Hold on.
Thanks.
Cool, man. Okay.
Videos in there?
Yeah.
Oh, do you wait?
It should work.
It's so sick.
Yeah.
You still do
I'll come up and help if needed. Not that I can promise that I could fix it.
Perfect. Thank you, Bubba.
Yeah, it's so cool.
How you guys all doing today?
It's all good.
Lovely day, not snowing today. So today I'm presenting on isocyanate exposure and asthma in the UK vehicle repair industry. My name is Drake Roskelley, and it is February 19th, 2026. So why this matters and kind of why I'm presenting on this. So little backstory, the other day, my buddy and I are working out of his shop, and he got this old F-350 that he was respraying. So we were respraying the hood, and he had proper respirator and everything on, but we didn't have a spray booth set up, and all the paint went everywhere around his shop. So we opened the doors after and let it air out, but there was still a smell for like a week. So I was just curious and kind of looked into this and was like, wow, should probably be a little smarter about that. But yeah, basically, occupational asthma is the most common occupational lung disease. And isocyanates are the leading cause of asthma worldwide. So that's found in spray paints, automotive paint, kind of whatever aerosol paints you got. And then auto body spray painting is also a high exposure risk for isocyanate exposure. So that's kind of these issues, or I guess the issue we're dealing with. So what are isocyanates? They're chemicals in polyurethane paints. So an example of that is hexamethylene diisonate. It's just basically what is in the paints. I don't know, it's a harmful chemical. And exposure is via inhalation or contact with the skin. And it can cause permanent asthma sensitization. So a bunch of not good stuff. So the biomonitoring concept that they used, this is kind of how they measured what they were looking for. So the HDI metabolized into UHDA in the urine, so that they would pull urine samples from these workers, and that's how they would see if it was in their body. So they used this as a biomarker of the exposure, and this helped evaluate the workplace controls that they were putting in place. So the purpose of the study, they were trying to compare exposure trends versus asthma trends. So they're just seeing like if exposure would go up, would asthma go up, vice versa. And the question they asked is if exposure decreases, does asthma decrease? Pretty straightforward. The study design, so they had 2 data sources. They were using that biomonitoring, collecting those urine samples. And they also used the SWORD asthma surveillance. That's just kind of a national database they're pulling data from. And then a little bit of overview of the methods. So for the exposure trends, it was on a logistic regression. And for the asthma trends, it was on a negative binomial regression. So that just created the 2-level models account for variability. Yeah. So as far as the exposure results, there was a significant decline in detectable UHDA after they put the measures in place. And there's about a 4% reduction per year of that. It doesn't sound like a lot, but that is a lot from 2008 to now, in my opinion. And then high exposures were still occurring, so those are kind of the outliers, just silly gooses not following the rules and not wearing their respirators or whatever. I don't know. There's a lot of dummies, so you're always going to see those outliers. And then as for the asthma results, there was a decline in the occupational asthma cases. And then there was also a decrease, or I guess the decrease began after 2008 when they instituted the interventions. So the intervention program that they came up with was this. It was a safety awareness training first that they instituted, and then they had free biomonitoring. They also increased inspections, and then they gave spray booth guidance, excuse me. So pretty much just teaching them how to do their job properly, wear their PPE properly, etc. Okay, so these are some little AI videos I made just based off of this.
Cyanates, powerful chemicals in 2-pack car paints, are one of the leading causes of occupational asthma. In vehicle repair shops, breathing in hexamethylene diisocyanate, or HDI, gets protected and from isocyanates. Here's how shops are cutting the risk even further. Keep ventilation systems running and maintained. Make sure respirators are worn and fit, tested every time. But early.
And then this little cartoon, this one's kind of funny.
Body shop spray paints contain isocyanates. Blimey, my chest feels like a bagpipe. Breathe them in and the lungs complain leading to occupational asthma. That's why I stick with the airfed musk. Fizzling bit snug in it. Feel like a goldfish in a helmet.
Better a goldfish than a wheezy walrus.
True that. With proper masks and ventilation, even the family dog can stay safe. Good boy, Rufus. He looks cooler than me. Keep everyone breathing.
Yeah. The power of AI these days. But yeah, just kind of reiterating how important it is to just wear the respirator and do things properly and safely.
Cyanates.
Oops. There we go. So the main conclusion that I drew from this is exposure and asthma decline together. So temporally, it's a consistent relationship, and this does not prove causation. So some strengths of the study, they were pulling from a large national database, so they were getting a lot of data. They had real world intervention evaluation, so they were able to see what they were doing and how it correlated. And then there was strong statistical modeling that they used. Some limitations I noticed is it was an ecological design. There was also participation bias, and there was underreporting in their surveillance as well. And then some implications. So the biomonitoring is a powerful IH tool. Interventions can be reduced or can reduce disease, excuse me. And then continuous monitoring is needed. That's what I've got. Some questions.
So you said asthma declined with the use of PPE, correct?
Mhm.
So what do you think as far as the PPE's effectiveness in this situation? Was that just PPE or did they have other controls in place?
It was primarily just PPE, and then they also set up spray booths. So they had a contained zone where it was being sprayed, and they had better ventilation as well. So engineering and PPE controls were instigated. And then obviously the administrative, so they're teaching them how to spray properly and do all that.
I'm just curious what the importance of this chemical is in these paints, and is there an alternative paint chemical or?
I'm sure there is.
Okay.
They describe it as like it's a hardener in the paint, so it's ultra durable. But I think a lot of it comes down to money because paint is made from petroleum. That's what everything's made from. So I think that they just use that because money, money, money. But how they used to make paint, they actually used to make it they use like cotton fibers. They didn't use plastic. And it was much more durable, but it wouldn't have the same sheen as it does now because it's all plastic.
So this is very popular right now.
Mhm.
Okay.
It's what they've used since like the 50s, 60s. Actually, no, later than that, like 80s, 90s, I think. My bad. Go ahead.
Yeah, Jake has a question online. What was the perceived smell of the isocyanate? I'm sure I mispronounced that. In your anecdotal experience, did you notice any personal sensitization?
No, because whenever I've been heavily spraying, I've always worn a vapor respirator, P100 proper respirator. But if I'm spraying spray paint outside and you get a little whiff of that, you know what it smells like, Jake. Anybody else?
What would your third question about this in the US? What do you think?
Well, I think there's a ton of asthma. Like it is a thing out here. It is a thing anywhere. And obviously, I think it'd look the same. You'd instigate the same kind of protocols and programs in place to protect workers. I'm sure these are in place, especially at more major companies. But yeah, I don't know why I would differ at all, really.
Spencer's got a question. Are these kinds of shops known for misusing PPE or having cultures where it's frowned upon to use it?
Yeah, and no. I think that, well, blue collar, there's always going to be that bully perspective because it's a lot of dudes working together and it can be interesting sometimes. But usually, I'd say most people, if they have their head on right, they're willing to protect themselves. Even I guess it depends on the workplace and what kind of your coworkers are like, I guess. But dealing with men, I know there's a competitive nature and there's a demeaning nature as well to us.
What do you think about the idea of voluntary versus mandatory? I don't know how much you know in terms of like the breakdown of what a typical employer or
Mhm.
mandatory, or is a typical employer just like do what you want?
The people I've worked for doing stuff like this, it's kind of been voluntary, encouraged, but you can do what you want and reap the repercussions later. But I think usually larger corporations, larger companies, anywhere where there's more than 30 employees, it's probably mandatory just to cover them on a legal standpoint, I would assume. But smaller shops, like I worked out of a shop where there was 6 dudes working there and there's a lot of shenanigans going on.
So if you were in charge of safety
Yeah.
at a plant like this,
Mhm.
what would you implement? Like what would you especially to try to tie it back to this article, like was there anything you take away from this article, or just in general, what would you do to prevent this situation?
Just for my workers' well-being, I would probably implement it mandatory, and then I would have provided PPE, and then I'd have extra if they leave it at home, just so that my ass is covered and they're not getting hurt or sick.
Have you looked into the US? Like, I imagine it's actually a little worse here,
Yeah.
but I don't know the numbers for it.
I didn't look into it, but I honestly don't know. I've seen some interesting things on the internet, Instagram, TikTok, so I'm sure there's a lot of funk.
It would be interesting to see some comparisons kind of up and down the size stack of firms, right? Because I would imagine like a lot of these, shade tree mechanic style like paint books have little to nothing, but like larger operations have more formalized procedures.
Well, then we could get into welding fume exposure and other cleaning chemicals and brake cleaner. There's a rigmarole of that stuff.
I could even see some like natural experiment stuff because I know a lot of this stuff. I don't know if this is the case for actual commercial operations, but in California, I know for consumers, like this, I think it's this chemical is banned for stuff like people can buy. So
Yeah.
if stuff gets banned at a commercial or industrial level, like I could see some natural experiments.
100%. Yeah, go ahead.
For the workers who do end up getting diagnosed with asthma, how likely are they to actually use their inhalers and seek treatment?
Yes. I don't know. I didn't see that anywhere in the article, so I don't know for sure. Maybe I missed it, but I don't have any information, unfortunately.
I guess like culturally,
Oh, of course.
how likely are they to see a doctor for?
Probably not very likely. Open up, I'm fine. Smoke some more cigarettes.
Right.
I've got asthma,
You do?
and yeah, when I was a kid, it was pretty bad, so I had an inhaler and all
Yeah.
that stuff. But as an adult, it's really exercise induced, as typically, or some other scenarios, but I don't have nearly as many asthma attacks as an adult as I did when I was a kid.
Gotcha.
When they do happen, they suck, and like I have trouble breathing.
Yeah.
And yet, I have not been to a doctor for it since I was a kid,
Wow.
and so that might indicate that, at least just based on one person's anecdotal experience, it's not something that affects me every day, or even close to every day, and so I let it ride.
Yep.
Which may do the same.
Is it like a shortness of breath or is it a hyperventilation?
It's like the experience is your windpipe narrows. At least I don't know if like physiologically that's what's happening, but that's what it feels like. And so as you draw breath, like you can tell you're not getting as much oxygen intake. And I've never had a situation where like it was an emergency.
Yeah.
But when I get an asthma attack, it feels like we're maybe on the verge of a potential situation where I'm really having trouble breathing.
Do you carry your inhaler?
No, I don't possess one. I don't have one. I haven't had one since I was a kid. So maybe this is a wake-up call for me to go to the doctor. We'll see what happens,
And don't spray paint.
Yeah, I will try to avoid that. Yeah.
Good idea.
But no, that is another thing that triggers like what I'm doing, like cutting wood or You know,
Fine.
tile or,
Particulate.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So if I don't wear a mask or do something like that is certainly something that triggers it.
I also imagine that in the UK, it's easier and cheaper to get an inhaler
Mhm.
than in the US.
I'm sure that's the case.
Cool. Any more?
Well, then we got a chat. Let me see.
Baby.
Oh, Rachel Dahl, physiologically, that is what's happening. So windpipe is narrower. Thanks, Rachel.
Oh, thank you.
Anything else? Cool. I guess I'll leave and head up to clinic and see if I can get an inhaler. Thanks, everybody. So.